Good morning.
Morning.
That's pretty weak. Good morning. Yeah, let's get livened up, right? Who's excited about farming this year?
You like swimming?
You like swimming? That's right. You know, it's kind of funny when I rolled up here yesterday and Grant said you had what, 1.8, 2 inches of rain? There was a pond out there in that soybean field and it's gone already. So that's kind of a testament to what Grant and Dawn have done out here, is really improved their soil's function, right? So I think that's really important to understand. Now Grant, he introduced me as an expert. I hate that word, as an expert. That puts you in a box. And I don't like boxes. I see a box, I tear it apart. You ever see a cat get in a box and they can just kind of live there? I'm like my blue heeler. He sees a box. If it comes on the front step, whatever you bought from Amazon is gone. You know? So that's the way I focus. I work outside of boxes. We farm in the most complex system of any type of occupation there is, you know? Think about your farm, or this farm, or any farm, right? And compare that to building cars. So once an engineer develops a car, designs a car, or whatever, right? It's pretty easy to build a lot of cars. But can you do the same thing in your farming operation as what an auto manufacturer can do, right? You think about soil fertility, plant nutrition, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, right? Tillage practices, how you plant, when you plant, the harvest, the rainfall, or the lack of rain, right? How many guys were really frustrated the last 3 years? Because what'd you face? Drought. Now what you got? Backwaters and flooding, right? You know, it's kind of funny. Every drought ends with a flood. Every flooding period, or really wet periods, usually end in a drought, or dry periods, right? So like in my area, we were about 10 to 12 inches behind on moisture April 1, looking at year to year, right? So we came into the cropping season 10 to 12 inches behind. And when I was sitting there looking at cover crops, digging in the soil, and I was like, guys, we've got to manage for this, because last year we let the cover crops grow too long and it sucked out a lot of moisture from our soil profile and our crops suffered. So I was like, maybe we need to terminate early. And then it started raining. And then it didn't stop raining for over a month, right? So we ended up catching like 18 inches of rain in a month's time there in my area. So let me give you a little background. I'm originally from Central Illinois, lived kind of South Central Illinois, down by St. Louis area, okay? You guys actually have black soils up here. I've got like white clay. You know, that driveway is actually a little bit darker than what our soils look like. So it's not much fun to work with. A lot of guys power dry it out, turn it into a powder. We get these big rainfall events, it turns it into cement. You could rollerblade on it if you want to. It's crazy. So thinking about that, the weather and how we manage that, I was like, guys, we need to terminate this cover crop early so we're not sucking up moisture. Well, it got away from us, and then we were planting into stuff that was, you know, we had a very mild spring, very mild winter. We had hairy vetch that was literally 58 inches tall, solid across the field. And that was not fun to plant into. It took a lot of management with it. We had to change our system, right? Had to adjust things on our planters. We had to be more patient. We had to have more flexibility. We're looking at things this year of how do we manage this next year? You know, looking at all of our fields, instead of saying we're going to treat every field the same, we're looking at it and saying, okay, what fields are primarily our wet fields? How are we going to manage that next year differently than a field that's got some hill ground and a lot of terraces, right? So you got to kind of think about that with your own farm. Maybe it's not a one size fits all, right? Like I said, it's a complex system. So each field is going to be different from each other, right? right? We all have variability in our fields, right? So how do we manage that variability? So real quick, before we catch out into the field, I want to recap a little bit about what Grant and Don were talking about, the principles. Anybody got their folders with them? Yeah, don't open them. It might be in there. This is a quiz. They talked about 6 principles. I'm not going to talk about 6 principles. I'm going to talk about 4. Okay? What are the main 4? Does anybody tell me? Drink beer. That's where the best ideas come from. And that marker is done. Anyway, so 4 principles. What do we got? Number 1.
Living roots.
Diversity. Living roots.
Contact.
I said 4. That's part of the 6. Disturbance. Keep it covered. There you go. Now those are principles. And what I found is, how many of you guys are on social media? Okay. Let me ask you, let me back up a step. How many of you guys have been doing this for 10 plus years? How many of you guys are row crop guys? Okay. And you've been doing it 10 plus years. How many of you been doing it 5 plus years? How many of you been doing it 1 to 3 years? Okay. So what I've noticed over the last really 3 years, but probably the last 4 to 5 years, is that when we start talking about these principles on social media, if you're applying fertilizer out there, you get shamed. If you go out there and you spray something on a field, you get shamed on it. If you go out there and you work a field, you get shamed, right? We've become purist, and Grant mentioned that. He mentioned about being a purist. Oh, thank you. And not being a purist, right? And me and Grant we started talking about this a lot probably in the last year, about this whole purist mentality. Where in those principles does it say, thou shalt not till? Does it say that? No. It says minimize disturbance, right? Maximize diversity when you can. Maximize the soil cover, armor, when you can, right? But the thing I get so frustrated with is there's so many purists out here that say you've got to do it this way and only this way, that I've seen way too many farmers that are so focused on, well, this is what we got to do because so-and-so said this is what it is, and so this is how we got to do it, and if we do it any other way, it's wrong, that they dang near go broke in trying to achieve that. You know? So I mentioned that hairy vetch is 58 inches tall. We had about 160 pounds of nitrogen in it. Okay? That's great. But if I can't get my cash crop planted in it, what good is it? Right? You're in the business of farming. Raise a cash crop, raise a cow, raise a chicken. Right? So we've got to focus on how do we produce a crop first and foremost, right? Now we can do things where we become way more efficient, you know, by using these cover crops, by using these principles, but really I like to look at these principles more as a guideline, right? There's a lot of these guys that are shaming guys about not following these principles. And I got a question, are they even following their own 10 commandments in the Bible? Thou shalt not covet your neighbor. What do? We shame our neighbor for doing tillage. Maybe we need to understand why they're doing it, right? So, how many of you guys have been to an event like this before? How many of you guys, this is your first time? So we got a couple, right? So where's the neighbors at? Grant and Don, where's your neighbors at? So here's the thing, how many of you guys, there's one, we got a neighbor, we got 2. How many of you guys go to your neighbors and you're like, you need to do this, why aren't you doing this? This is the best thing since sliced bread, right? And how many times do your neighbors just get turned off by you? Or they start arguing with you, right? That happens quite a bit, right? Think about this year. You plant a seed out there and it rains 12 inches in a week. What happened to that seed? It rotted. So when you're going out and talking with your neighbors and talking to your peers about this system of farming, don't overwater the seed. Plant the seed, walk away. Let them come to it with their own terms, if that makes sense. So Mark had mentioned this morning that, hey, this build day, this is all about for you guys, right? So this isn't me and Russell or Liz or Grant and Don or whoever to be up here preaching to you guys. This is not church. We're not going to preach to you. We hope that you can take something away, but I really thrive on like interaction amongst everybody. So like if you guys have questions, stop us, ask us. If you've got an issue on your farm, bring it up. Let's talk about it. Let's discuss it, because that's where we learn. I learn more in the field than I do in a classroom. I was horrible in college. I hated sitting through presentations, looking at PowerPoints. I'm more of a hands-on type of guy. And what I find is most farmers are pretty hands-on, right? You learn from going out and seeing and doing things. So, what's the two most important tools that you have in your toolbox? Your brain, correct. What's the other one? Your hands? Well, your hands need to have this in it when you go out there, because you can learn a lot about your soils, your plants, and a lot of different things with a good spade. Don't buy a cheap one that breaks. Bends on you, you know. This is a good tool to keep in your truck. If you got 2 trucks, keep 2 of them in it. You might leave one somewhere. You'll have to go buy another one. It's all right. But this is a powerful tool that can tell you a lot. How many of you guys have a pentrometer? Okay, y'all got a pentrometer. I find this way more useful than a pentrometer. And here's why. I take that pentrometer, push it down on dry soil, and it's going to max out, right? I can take a bottle of water, pour it on that soil, and push it down, and it won't. It's a pretty good indicator of how much moisture is in your soil. And yeah, you can find that compaction layer and everything, but that spade or that shovel is going to tell you so much more about your soil structure, about what your roots are doing and everything. So when I was in ag retail, doing a lot of tissue tests and stuff like that, if we come back and show, well, here we are with these micronutrients and where they're at, but here's some macronutrients that are a little bit off. First thing you should do is probably go out, we applied all this fertilizer, this copious amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, because the big 3 is what we sell. Made a lot of money on, right? That's what you guys buy, because that's what we think makes a lot of corn or makes a lot of whatever that crop is. And our tissue tests come back, well, you're short nitrogen. Well, how could that be? I applied 240 pounds. We'll go out there and dig and find out where our roots are. Maybe take a soil test at different depths and see what's going on in that soil. How much rain did we get? How much rain did we not get? All those things come to effect. And that tool right there can teach you a lot about that. Another thing that I use a lot. Grant had mentioned, and I had this in my truck, luckily, so he had mentioned about calibrating drills. How many of you guys use a lot of diverse cover crop mixes? Where's the drill setting for a 10-way mix? It's not on there, right? So I found this tool on Shoop Manufacturing, or Shoop website, but literally comes in a little bag. You put it on one of your seed tubes. You drive, if it's 7.5 inches, you drive 232 feet. Stop, pour out what seed you've collected in that bag into this. Use that sliding scale, and it'll level out to tell you how many pounds per acre you're putting out there. This will save you a tremendous amount of headache and a tremendous amount of money by calibrating your equipment properly. Okay. Another new tool come out. This was developed by Mr. Rick Haney, Dr. Rick Haney, and it's kind of fell asleep on me here. This is actually a pretty cool deal. How many of you guys hear about microbes in your soil, right? How many of you guys are measuring the microbes in your soil and understand what they're doing? And probably the last 6 years, the biological industry has exploded. There's a lot of farmers that aren't planting a cover crop that are using bug in a jug microbes, and that's fine. That's okay. But we know that there's a tremendous amount of microbes in the soil, but what are they doing for us? So we can actively measure that with this tool. This tool can actively measure CO2. So right now, we're looking at that. What's that number say?
475.
475. So right now, there's a little pump inside here with a little CO2 sensor, and it's drawing in the CO2 from right here in the atmosphere into that and measuring it. We can stick this tube in the ground, wait 15, 20 minutes, ideally wait overnight, and then come back and measure it. And we can determine how much microbial activity we have in that soil at that time. So microbes are making those nutrients for us, right? Especially nitrogen. We can actually use this to determine how much nitrogen is available to that crop today. And we start thinking about that. One of the things that I'm going to talk about a little bit with soil fertility, and when Russell talks, I mean, Russell blows my mind even, but I want y'all to start thinking about pounds per acre per day, because that's what the plant is taking up throughout its whole lifestyle cycle. And we could get into talking about that in here a little bit later, or tomorrow, but looking at how many total pounds per acre per day does that plant take up from the time it germinates until the time it's finished at reproductive stage, right? It's mind-blowing to think that we're fertilized this much, but the plant's actually taking up this much. Where's it coming from? And how does it get it? So the healthier that soil is, the more functioning that soil is, the more microbes we have in that soil that are respirating and breaking down these bonds and releasing these nutrients, and the more that plant is photosynthesizing and pumping sugars back into that soil system to feed these microbes in exchange for nutrients, the higher that respiration rate is, the more of that nutrient cycling we get, right? So somebody mentioned earlier about these carbon markets out here, right? We're at 450 parts per million in the atmosphere, okay? The Ice Age started at 850. Think about that. That was before humans were out here, okay? But yeah, there's a lot of trees and there's a lot of everything else. My fear right now is if we think back to the late 70s, and you guys that are a little bit older than me, I was born in 84, but it's still part of when I was a young kid. What was the big focus in the 70s and 80s?
Acid rain.
From what?
Power plant.
Sulfur, right? So how many of y'all are now applying sulfur on your fields? Okay. So sulfur was measured in parts per billion. So we cleaned up the atmosphere, removed sulfur out of the atmosphere so we don't get that free sulfur anymore. Well, carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur in the atmosphere are cyclical. They go together. So we remove one thing, and guess what sulfur dioxide had on the atmosphere? A cooling effect. So we remove the thing that has the cooling effect, and guess what maintained the same? CO2. What does CO2 have? Heating effect. Huh. I wonder where all this goes to, right? So now we remove the thing that has a cooling effect. Now we got global warming everybody's talking about, climate change. Well, maybe it's man-made because we're interfering too much with things, right? So here's the thing is, this winter I was at an event in Decatur, Illinois speaking, and we were talking about the CO2 and everything, and we were talking about cover crops and keeping that soil covered and the residue on that soil. And professor from U of I was sitting there talking about it, and talking about lowering the CO2 in the atmosphere. I said, well, if we lower the CO2, that means the nitrous oxide levels are going to be really high. And what happens when you have too much in nitrous oxide compared to CO2? Everything dies, right? And he got to talking about it, and he said, well, right now there's already researchers out here, not researchers, but some companies, groups out here that are looking at the emissions coming off of the cover crop residues and saying that the nitrous oxide coming off of that, the gas, is accelerating the nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. So mark my words, we went through a sulfur cycle, now we're going into a carbon cycle, and then within 10 years we're going to have a nitrogen problem. Okay? There's a lot of people that make a lot of money on your backs at the end of the day. So that's just a disclaimer. I'm going to get off my soapbox on that. You might want to cut that out. You might want to leave it in. I don't care. But this is really cool. This is good technology out here. Any questions?
DEF is made out of nitrogen.
DEF is.
We have to put DEF in our tractors. Now we're putting nitrogen in the air.
Yeah. The funny thing about that is DEF is made from what? Nitrogen made from urea, right? Okay. So how much energy does it take to produce urea? And then we liquefy it with water, and then we put it in a plastic jug that can't even be reused in a cardboard box. But we feel good about it. Now, I'll tell you, DEF is actually the best fertilizer you can use. It's great fertilizer. It's in the amine form of nitrogen. You can make it at home, really. I mean, probably not run in your vehicle, but you can make it as a fertilizer and use it, foliar feed or wide drop, and it's awesome. And it's pretty cheap.
So you didn't bring up the point to them that if we lower the CO2, we lower the productivity of every plant on the planet?
Absolutely.
So we've just lowered our food production and everything?
Well, and that brings up another good point. You start looking at some of the literature out here, and there's some guys talking about how we only have maybe 40 years left of phosphorus, right? And you look at the growing population, and you look at a bottle of soda, or here's the thing. You go to a grocery store, where's the best food at in the grocery store? On the outside. What's on the inside? Processed food, right? And if you start looking at some of that processed food, it's made with a lot of phosphoric acids, right? Well, that's basically the same thing. How many of you all are using the low salt starter fertilizer? Right? So guess what? That's coming from the same granite that they're using to use in that food. So all of a sudden, if we're going to have a phosphorus problem in the next 25, 30 years, even 1034O comes off that same rock. 1034O will become a high value fertilizer. So we're going to figure out ways how we can become more efficient with phosphorus and potassium. Fertilizer prices going down or going up? Up, right? They come down a little bit, but they've been on an upward trend. If you really look at it, we are not even the #1 users of potash from Canada. Mexico, South America, they are. China, huge, right? So that price is going to keep going up, you know, as they're using more than we are. And honestly, the crazy thing is you start looking at some of these other countries and their yield production is going way up. Guess what ours has? It's really flattened out. And if you want to look at wheat, our wheat yield increases are horrible compared to other countries. So you know, we got to start thinking, especially in terms of soil, when we start thinking about soil health, the challenge becomes how do we feed that crop, and how do we make sure that that crop is being fed to have those higher yields? Because what happens if our yields start declining through this journey? Well, if we're taking crop insurance, our APH goes down, right? So now that causes a lot of other issues too. But then our profitability can go down as well, and that's really bad. Our neighbor might be farming our farm in 5 years if we're not careful. So we gotta look at how do we manage that nutrient to feed that crop, and how do we gotta manage that cover crop to make sure that we can actually get in there and feed it when it needs to, right? Trying to side dress corn when you've got this much residue is not fun.